I was a classics major at Princeton University, so I studied ancient Latin and Greek for quite a few years because I'd gone to a very classical Jesuit high school.
Right.
And then I decided to go into medicine, even though I had a great love of both philosophy and the history of religion and literature and languages. And so I eventually wound up at my psychiatry program at Yale University in New Haven. And I had seriously thought about, after finishing my residency, at which point, I was a clinical psychiatrist. I was seriously thinking of going to the Yale Department of Religion and getting a PhD.
Oh, wow.
So, because I've always had an academic interest, especially in the history of religion as well. But I got intrigued by a very interesting clinical job at a long-term psychiatric hospital in New York called New York Hospital Westchester Division. And it was quite interesting working with especially some of the big names in psychoanalysis at that time. Went on to Columbia, because I also am I'm also a faculty member now at Columbia, and studied formally psychoanalysis.
Oh, wow.
But in more recent years, because I am Catholic and because several Catholic exorcists solicited my opinion, I didn't really volunteer for this. I got to see an awful lot of these cases of suspected demonic influence. And at the same time, I was asked also to teach a course on demonic attacks and its relationship to, psychiatric conditions at the local Catholic Archdiocesan Seminary. So at the moment, I'm a professor of psychiatry, excuse me, at a medical college called New York Medical College.
Yes.
And I'm also teach at Columbia, and I also teach at the Archdiocesan Catholic Seminary. So I've been able to kind of use this interdisciplinary interest of mine, which is how I would describe my academic interest, to also hook up with different academic institutions.
Well, I think interdisciplinarity, as you know better than I do, no doubt, that people very often, there's a lot of talk of it, the importance of interdisciplinarity, but all too often people don't necessarily practice it. It's not easy to do, of course, bridging these multiple, sort of being able to be comfortable in different disciplines and to have meaningful discussions across boundaries, but absolutely essential, I think, for where we're at currently. I think it's always been the case, but especially today. And
yeah, I really think a lot of thoughtful people try to stretch themselves to do interdisciplinary stuff.
Yes.
Much of the academy is so specialized, and I think that's why I did not go on to graduate school in religion, which was a strong academic interest. I just felt like it would be too specialized, and that I preferred not only to be, I wanted to be a practicing physician and clinical psychiatrist, but also sort of, rather than becoming overly specialized, continue my interdisciplinary study in some ways on my own, but also in conjunction with some of the faculty at those institutions.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And I really appreciate what you just said about your own appreciation of people who like to stretch themselves intellectually, because again, I'm sort of just repeating essentially what you just said. All too often people, it's easy to get comfortable in whatever we're good at doing and whatever we're used to doing. But if we're always growing, always pushing the boundaries, always seeking to bridge build, and to challenge also, I think, some one of the issues that I have with hyper specialization in terms of one's disciplinary sort of affiliations is, while it's very productive, let's say from the point of view of modern science, it allows us to have these incredible technological advancements, of course. But then I think one of the major downsides, and I think the jury is also still out as to whether all these incredible technological advancements are all good, right? We increasingly, I think that not only is the jury out on that now, I think it's increasingly more and more obvious that all these incredible, mind-blowing modern advancements maybe are having, not only maybe are having major deleterious effects on the environment, on who we are as people, how we see ourselves in the world, and so forth. In any case, in addition to that, I think the problem with hyper-specialization is that one has to, as it were, not always, but typically one has to buy into the paradigm of the discipline, whatever these overarching umbrella notions are. And which is, again, can be productive, but also I'm interested in thinking about what things are allowed by certain paradigms and what things are disallowed by those same.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think the paradigms can cause a kind of intellectual shackling.
Yes.
And the narrowness of some of the academy, can lead to somewhat reductionistic ways of looking at human nature. And so, I think a public intellectual like yourself recognizes that you have to study a number of different fields to really, do the complexity of human nature justice.
Well, thank you so much for that. And in your own work, of course, you are very much challenging these disciplinary the sort of blinkered nature of many of these disciplines in bridging this incredible, bridging the gap between these apparently disparate worlds, which is psychiatry, which is firmly rooted in modern medicine and everything that comes under that rubric, and demonology, which, I laugh not because, I think it's fascinating, but I laugh because it's brilliant. That demonology in a sort of modern scientific paradigm, to even conceptualize of demons is problematic. You know better than I do, and there's no explanation for how do you address? I don't want to apologize for jumping the gun a little bit, but I imagine that perhaps some of your work, so the demonic foes, right? What has the reaction been to your work been like from colleagues in the medical profession? Because you're a man of science, of course. You're a man who's firmly rooted in science on the one hand, and at the same time you do also teach a class on demonology. So it's a fascinating bridge to build there, right there.
Well, let me just take a step back and talk a little bit about the epistemology of what
yes, please.
How I think. And this is very much in the Catholic intellectual tradition, I would say in the Orthodox Christian tradition as well.
Yes, of course.
We very much do not see a contradiction between science and faith.
Right. The same in the Islamic tradition, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the encyclicals, as you may well know, of John Paul II,
yes,
was called Fides et Ratio, faith and reason, and it was very much the idea that the central Christian, and I'm not excluding other religions, but the central mainstream Christian tradition has valued both sort of the inheritance of Greek thought and logic and all that, but also has accepted the role of faith, but reasoned faith. So what I try to do in my writing, and that's certainly reflected in my book, demonic foes about my experience consulting on cases of diabolic attack,
Yes.
is to say there's really no contradiction between what I do and science at its best. The discernments I help clergy of different faiths make, and that includes imams, by the way, as well as ministers and certainly Catholic priests, and I also work with people of no religion.
Yes.
These are not patients of mine. What I'm doing is I'm usually consulting either directly for them if they've sought me out on their own, or for their spiritual advisors.
Yes.
And I'm attempting to be very rigorous, in many ways very scientific.
Yes.
In the Catholic tradition, the criteria for demonic attacks is quite strict. I mean, this is not sort of spiritual intuition. And I would make a distinction between naturalistic illnesses, which, often have a psychological stress-inducing component, but naturalistic illnesses using sort of a biomedical model, which underlies modern medicine, and spiritual attacks per se. I mean, they are very different things. In the New Testament, Jesus himself, who was known as a healer and an exorcist, he himself, as well as the early church, made a very strong distinction between what he was doing in that aspect of his ministry. In other words, they would talk about his healing illnesses, but also delivering people from evil spirits. And they were regarded as separate. Now, that doesn't mean that either one is more scientific than the other. Theology in the Christian tradition has always been regarded as a type of science. It's not really accepted in modern methodological naturalism as a science. But what I see in what I try to accomplish in the book is to say, I accept modern science. I accept the Big Bang. I accept evolution. I accept certainly and appreciate, the great modern advances of science in medicine and engineering, etc. But that in no way disproves the value of reasoned study of spiritual phenomena as well. So that the Catholic Church, for instance, has long used doctors for centuries to help discern diabolic attacks,
Oh, wow.
which are not really, just plugging in my computer here, which are not really illnesses. I don't regard them as illnesses. I regard them as things that need spiritual help, in the same way that I am then able to distinguish people with medical or psychiatric problems, which are sometimes confused with demonic attacks, and have been more historically than in today's world. But and those things often, benefit from biomedical interventions.
Yes.
Now, I suppose, I share some of your own interest in a more holistic view of health.
Yes.
I'm certainly not reductionist. The psyche plays a great role in both the precipitation as well as the remediation of even many physical illnesses. But I do think biomedical understanding and what we call evidence-based understanding, I know you referred to that in one of your comments to me, is very important, as long as it doesn't become reductionistic, as long as it is understood in a broader, you might say, humanistic context. But in terms of my discerning illnesses, I am diagnostically, I'm a pretty, standard clinician and physician. And I value that intellectual tradition, that academic tradition of medicine very strongly. When I'm dealing with people who are undergoing what the church has long classified very rigorously as extraordinary attacks of the demon, of the demonic world, and I do believe in evil spirits as really is an integral part of all the Abrahamic faiths. I don't throw out my rigor, but I realize that the criteria for their discernment has to be, in a sense, scientific as well. Now, by those, I mean things like possessions and what we call oppressions and stuff, which then require spiritual help, not medical help. So I hope I've made those distinctions clear, the way at least
No, that's
I
very
understand them.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a little bit, if you could kindly provide some details as to, you mentioned that there's some rigorous criteria based upon which one receives or does not receive a diagnosis of demonic possession or attack or oppression. What are some of those criteria?
Well, let's take possession as the kind of paradigm of a severe attack on a human being, going beyond far any kind of just normal demonic influence that we see of in terms of temptations or whatever. And of course, I'm not blaming human nature has free will, and I'm not blaming the demonic for all human problems or anything, let alone illnesses.
No, of course. But it exists. I mean, from the paradigm from which you're working, the paradigm that I use to make sense of the world, there are unseen entities in the sort of Quranic narrative. I apologize for interrupting, but very quickly, if I may mention, in the Quranic sort of Islamic narrative around reality and how, as believers in God, how we must sort of orient ourselves. One of the formulas, the way it's presented, I'm sure you aware of this, is I believe in the seen and the unseen, and that God has created. One of the famous verses in the Quran is God only created, in sort of rough translation, God only created human beings and jinns, right, the unseen entities, so that they may worship him, right? So it's very clearly spelled out, right? So anyway, I just wanted to...
Yeah, I think the Islamic and Christian views about, angels, for instance, as we call them, who rebelled against God and because of their free will, which they share with human beings, free will and free will to accept or reject the authority of God, underpins a lot of this, knowledge of the unseen world. And it's certainly a set of topics that were very lively at the time of the founding of Christianity, and certainly something that we Christians believe Jesus, not only spoke about, but had a great authority about.
This is central to his mission in many ways.
Absolutely. And he said that. And he said, you know, that, I mean, he pointed to his own healing and miracles and exorcism as a sign of the coming of the kingdom of God. He very explicitly says, if you see ultimately God healing the sick and driving out demons, and again, he made that distinction. These were two different things. Healing the sick and driving out demons were different things. Know that the kingdom of God is at hand. It was a very important sign in his view of the entrance of more of the fullness of revelation to the world. And of course, within several centuries, including what I would see as its influence on Islam, it in fact did spread all over the world, that original revelation to the Jewish people. So, but to get back to your question about criteria, the Catholic theological, you might even say demonological tradition has always been to recognize gradations of demonic attack. And there's ordinary demonic attacks, and then there's extraordinary demonic attacks, which are more overt and powerful interference on human beings. And there are three sorts of those. There's what we call infestations, where, you know, spirits may appear in a place, or etc. Hauntings, that sort of thing. Then there are oppressions. Spiritual writers have used different terms, but just to use some of the modern terminology. There's oppressions, which are physical and cognitive attacks on human beings. And then there's the nth degree, which is possessions. And possessions implies that an evil spirit has gotten very strong, or sometimes for periods intermittently, total control of the human personality. And for instance, to diagnose a possession, you really need very strict evidence. In the manuals, which are updated versions of the Roman ritual from the 1600s, the criteria are laid out very, very clearly. Essentially, you have to see clear evidence, and this is, in the words of the Catholic Church, to a moral certitude. In other words, it's not supposed to be a guess. This is supposed to be, we're going to make a very strong discernment. And the priest and the exorcist are supposed to use consultation with physicians as needed, but they are supposed to take the ultimate responsibility for this spiritual diagnosis. And
for subsequent healing and treatment, of course.
Yes. Which, of course, I'm not an exorcist. You know, I consulted the exorcist. I'm not an exorcist myself.
Did you ever consider?
Because it's a spiritual ministry.
Okay, right. So that's part of one spiritual. That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, in the Catholic Church, you know, it's confined at the moment. It wasn't always, but it's confined at the moment to priests.
I see. Right.
So in terms of the criteria, you really have to see some very clear evidence of a foreign intelligence operating. And the more normal way in which that occurs is that there are always exceptions, you know, as in any complex subject, but the normal criteria will involve a person going into a trance of sorts, and a demonic voice emerging from that person, using their vocal cords, but clearly seeming to present themselves as a foreign entity. And that entity is quite hostile, is quite arrogant, is especially contemptuous of anything religious. But there should be supporting evidence of other strong suggestive signs, often what in the last 150 years has been regarded as paranormal. So the key, or at least the classic suggestive criteria that are mentioned, for instance, in the updated versions of the Roman ritual, is you can gain more certitude if this spirit, who was now presumed or at least hypothesized to take some control of the individual, does a few things, like all of a sudden speaks foreign languages that the person had never studied. All of a sudden exhibits supernatural level of strength to an enormous degree beyond human capacity, or can contort or cause abnormal movement in the individual that clearly indicates there's something beyond the human there. And finally, that this entity may reveal hidden knowledge. The Latin term is latra, that they know things that the person could not possibly know otherwise, or has other psychic abilities, or has other such bizarre signs or symptoms that this goes beyond normal human abilities. So I mean, the final thing that you're looking for is the historical context, because people don't get possessed just out of the blue. The modal person who gets possessed, and again, it's a complex subject, but the modal person is a person who has turned to occultism or evil in some serious way. In a sense, they have invited the spirit in, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps implicitly more than explicitly. And those are the kind of criteria, Mr. Azad, that you want to see before you have this moral certainty, and then get the permission of the authority of the church, who has to be the bishop, to do a formal exorcism. May I give an example?
Please do, yes.
You mentioned in my book, which was recently published, if you don't mind me saying, by HarperCollins, called Demonic Foes. The subtitle is my 25 years as a psychiatrist investigating possessions, demonic attacks, and the paranormal.
I love it. Yes.
And I mean, it was called by my chairman of psychiatry, Unique in History, because it's a detailed study of a number of these cases by a professor of psychiatry.
So much needed.
And I have probably seen more of those cases than any other physician in the world.
How many?
Because people have consulted me from all over.
Yes. How many have you seen, you say, roughly?
I have heard about many, because I'm now the longest standing American member of the International Association of Exorcists, which is approved by the Vatican. I've been sort of on their governing board and serve as a bit of a scientific advisor for a long time. I'm not on the governing board now, but I am the longest standing member of that group from America. And so I've heard about many, many cases. I've seen myself, by that I mean I've actually, examined these people personally, certainly over 100 cases of possession. When you throw the doors wider open and you include people who have clear, overt attacks but are not fully possessed,
Yes, sir.
I have definitely seen hundreds of those. Now, I don't mean to imply that they're common. They're rare. But the reason that I see these cases is because, again, I've evaluated people from all over the world who have contacted me.
Yes, yes.
But let me get back, because I think it illustrates well what you had originally asked about the
Yes.
criteria. So in the book, Demonic Foes, I have a chapter on an extraordinary case that I came to know very well. It was certainly a fortuitous opportunity, I would say providential, to get to know a case of an incredibly flamboyant possession. Very, very, I'm going to put the computer down, very in depth. And what made it remarkable, the exorcists themselves described her to me. There were two exorcists involved. They were very busy fellows. And at the time in America where there weren't that many official exorcists. And so they would show me many, many cases because they would work on cases all across the United States and then tell me about it, sometimes bring them to New York, where I, at that point, was an academic psychiatrist, still am. And so I saw a lot of cases because most exorcists are confined to their, what we call their diocese, their little district. So they only see cases in that district, and hence they don't see very many cases. But I was seeing cases from all over the United States and hearing about cases from all over the world. So that's why I've had so much experience. But this remarkable case, which has kind of been written about all over the internet by this point, I gave her a pseudonym. I, of course, as a physician, I never reveal identifying details, but everything I talk about is exactly accurate. So this woman I called Julia, not her real name. And what was remarkable about my assessing her was, if you think about it, first of all, she was a highly placed member of a satanic cult. Now, I, as a psychiatrist, had gone through, and a very experienced clinician, had gone through what we call the Satanic Panic of about 30 years ago in America, where fundamentalists were seeing cults everywhere. Everybody was getting diagnosed as, well, your problems are because of Satanism and you were ritually abused, and cults are kidnapping people all over the United States. It was clearly exaggerated, and it was somewhat, delusional and or just mistaken. As for instance, in the United States to this day, there is still these talks of, Satanists having infiltrated our political circles. I mean, there's these kind of conspiracy theories, you might say, which continue to this day. But Julia was an example, in my opinion, of the rare, truly genuine, nefarious case of a cultist. And she described herself not only as a ordinary member of the cult, she described herself as its queen and a high priestess. It was remarkable, if you think about it, that she was willing to talk to me about it.
Yes.
Because, really, she was also terrified of talking to me because she was afraid that the cult would retaliate. She was still a member of the cult. So that was remarkable. Her possession and attendant psychic abilities were also extraordinary and were described by the two exorcists, very prominent U.S. exorcists that I work with, as a once-in-a-century case. And third, equally remarkable, even though I write about a number of cases with their permission, in a disguised manner of their identifying information, Julia, I think in a little bit of gratitude towards me, said, Dr. Gallagher, I don't want you to ever tell people where I live and my name. However, you can write about this case as much as you want. I think she thought that would be of some public benefit. And the exorcist himself also verified all the details of this case on a radio program many years ago. So this was a dramatic case. Now, how does she illustrate what we were talking about, the different criteria? Well, number one, during the exorcisms, she spoke a number of foreign languages. Now, I must say, I've been to several hundred exorcisms in my life. I have heard different languages spoken, some of which I know. I know French, I know Latin, I know ancient Greek. And that's not uncommon, and I've heard that. I remember going to an exorcism once where the person was speaking some kind of European-sounding languages. I didn't know it, neither did anybody else, except the priest exorcist, who later said, oh yeah, my family is from Bulgaria, and she was speaking Bulgarian. So during the exorcisms, which were described to me, I did not go to Julia's exorcism. I'm, you know, as you may imagine, I'm a pretty busy guy. And I couldn't travel there. And she spoke a number of languages. She was fighting to escape. I mean, she had given permission to be held down, but then during the exorcism, when the demon surfaced, she was fighting to escape literally for hours in a way that seemed just incredibly superhuman, you might say. And during that exorcism, according to 8 salt of the earth people, including the 2 exorcists, including 2 nurses who I spoke to, she levitated. She levitated for about a half an hour. And during the course of my career, I've heard from about 30 people levitations during possessions. Now, again, this is rare stuff. It's reported by, you know, parapsychologists at times and in other religions, you know, Eastern religions. And I believe it. And number 3, she often...
If I may quickly mention, this is sort of almost the archetypal image that maybe everyone has from the famous, of course, or infamous movie, The Exorcist.
Which was also based on a real case, by the way.
Right, this is what I heard, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then in addition, she had this third, what I call suggestive criteria of a foreign entity. She knew many, many hidden secret things about people. For instance, she told me, you know, how my mother had died of ovarian cancer, but she knew that about a lot of people. And even more remarkably, she had some other psychic abilities. Now, let me make a distinction here because it can seem confusing. During an exorcism, the evil spirit will often reveal this hidden knowledge, much as certain psychics have the ability to do that. And I think the source is the same, by the way.
Right, my intuition as well, yes, very often, yes.
But in her case, because she was this, you know, high person in a satanic cult, I mean, she worshiped Satan. I mean, this was a serious disciple of what she understood was Satan. She felt she had been granted some of these abilities, not when a spirit would speak through her and she'd be in a trance or something, but on her own. Let me give you a couple of examples.
Did she feel as though this was a gift that was given?
She felt it was a gift.
Right.
I mean, in the same way that sometimes psychic feels they're gifts, but they don't really know the ultimate source. She felt she was incredibly psychically gifted, but through the intercession, through the bestowal of the gift by Satan himself. And let me give you an example, for instance.
Yes.
I don't know if you've heard in paranormal circles, The term paranormal, by the way, for reasons we can get into if you want, I believe is a pseudoscientific term. You know, earlier ages either regarded this stuff as supernatural from God, or preternatural was the word used, which was essentially meant from evil forces. Now, the modern European scientific community had to come up with a term. How do we explain these bizarre stuff that doesn't imply, you know, a religious provenance? And they came up with this term paranormal. So I use the term paranormal, but I think it's basically a pseudoscientific one.
Yes.
But the students of the paranormal, the parapsychologists, another term, often say some people seem to have this ability of what they call remote viewing. Other people use the word clairvoyance, which is a confusing term, but they can see things at a distance. And she had described this, it turned out to be a Jesuit priest once. She described his office to me. And I said, but Julia, you told me you never went to his office. He was a Jesuit and a psychiatrist. And she said to me, Dr. Gallagher, you have a lot to learn. She didn't really want to go into it at the time. But later, we were talking about when she was going to have an exorcism. I had many conversations with this woman.
Yes.
And it was not because the priests were confused about her diagnosis. They knew darn well this woman was possessed. But it was her ambivalence about getting spiritual help that they wanted me to explore with her, including psychological. So I'm talking to her, and she says, you know, the demons really hate. He called himself, literally, this was what he called himself. He called himself Father A. He used his own pseudonym, which I think of as sort of a nom de guerre. And she said, you know, I can see him because Satan hates him so much. He gives me that gift to see him. I said, you know, give me a break. What are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. She goes, no, I can see him right now. I said, okay. And I did use the word smarty pants. I said, okay, smarty pants, tell me what he's doing right now. And she said, well, I see him walking along the beach in the community where he lives. And I said, and what is he wearing? And she said, he's wearing a blue windbreaker and he's wearing khaki pants. And so I said, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Julia. I'm going to call him. And by this point, you know, I had his cell phone, and by this point, he had become a friend of mine. So I called him up, and I didn't tell him why I was calling. I said, hi, Father A, how are you doing? And he said, you know, everything's going well. He said, I'm saying my prayers, my breviary. And I said, where are you? And he said, well, who wants to know? And I said, well, I want to know. And he said, well, normally I would be at, you know, my residence, but I decided unusually to take a walk along the beach tonight and say my prayers walking along the beach. And I said, and what are you wearing? And he said, oh, I know what's going on. You're talking to Julia, right? And I said, yes, what are you wearing? He said, I have a windbreaker. I said, what color? Blue. And he said, I have my khaki pants on. So this was a sample of her psychic abilities. You might say her hidden knowledge in a broader sense.
How did you feel, if you don't mind asking, Dr. Gallagher, when Father Ray confirmed Julia's sort of you know, what she saw? How did you feel immediately?
Believe it or not, by that point,
you wasn't something
I knew her well enough.
Yeah.
And I knew she had, you know, she had told me how my mother died. She told me how a lot of other people died.
Yes.
She was clearly in possession of this, you know, later to use the Latin that the church uses as one of the criteria. And so I was not really taken aback that much, you know. I'll tell you what may have been the spookiest thing that also exhibited something about this case, the paranormal, preternatural elements of the case. So prior to that, I mentioned that she worked with two priests, and the priest who originally introduced me to this field had called me and had asked me if I was able to attend one of the exorcisms. She had about eight exorcisms in all. And I said, I started to say to him, unfortunately I had, I don't know, family obligations or academic obligations or something, and I couldn't make the trip. Now, right as we were talking, and we knew where Julia was because she didn't live in our area. She lived, about 1,000 miles away, actually, and then she would come to our area to see me and for spiritual help. Now, I had heard the demonic voice come out of her previously. That in itself is an interesting little story if we have time.
Yes, of course.
And I'm on the phone. Now I'm on a landline with this guy. Now, she's 1,000 miles away. She's not on the phone. We knew where she was because she told us she went home. The voice comes in over a demonic voice comes in over the phone.
Oh.
And repeats exactly what she would say in some of her trances when I was with her.
Oh.
And it said, "We said, leave her alone, you effing priest.
Oh.
She's ours. You'll be sorry."
Oh.
Now that mimicked exactly what this voice had said one day. And this is the first time I heard her speak in a trance. The priest and I had been driving around with her in the backseat of a car, and we're chatting away. And all of a sudden we notice she's in the backseat. We notice she's going into a trance. And the voice comes out of her, that same voice that I later heard over the telephone line. I tell all these stories in the book at a little more length, Demonic Foes. But she starts saying in this kind of guttural voice, which again, it was not disembodied. It was clearly using, possession is control of the body. So it was using her vocal cords, but in a more guttural way, different kind of personality, said, listen, you effing priest, she is ours. She belongs to us, not you. You'll regret this. And then I remember during this about 5-minute little diatribe, him saying, this creature saying, you monkey priest, which I took it as a very good indication of how evil spirits regard us. They regard us as bestial. They regard us as animalistic.
As lowly, right.
Very lowly.
Yes,
sort of the hierarchy of creation. And yet they're also in some ways jealous of us, especially because they feel we still have some relationship with God. And so they hate us probably mostly because they hate God and they hate the image of God in us. And they're far more intelligent than we are, at least some of them seem to be. I presume probably most of them as pure spirits, as what we would say is fallen angels. People sometimes say to me, well, how come in a lot of these reports, they seem to speak Latin? And I say to them, in my opinion, they don't just speak Latin. They can speak any language because they're highly intelligent. They've been around since the dawn of...
I was going to say they're ancient as well, right?
They're ancient.
Yes.
Yeah. And so they've observed us. Their intellectual capacities are far beyond us. So they can speak any language. And I've heard multiple languages during many exorcisms. Even more characteristically, they will understand the Latin prayers of the priest. So the priest will be commanding them in Latin sometimes, and they'll understand the prayers and they will make mocking comments in reply.
In Latin as well.
Well, usually actually in English, because I think they want the audience to
witness it.
And most people, I can speak Latin, the priest doesn't know Latin, but Most people who attend these things cannot.
Fascinating, yes.
Kind of, getting back to your original.
They're real performers, in other words. I mean, it's almost as if they're
I think they're showing off,
Yes.
and I think it's a mark of superiority.
Yes, yes,
And they seem highly humiliated
yes.
by the idea that we human animals, we evolved monkeys, have power over them, which of course a good exorcist says we don't have power over them. We have power over them because of God, because of our Lord.
Yes, of course. Yes.
But they certainly are arrogant and show-offs, and they also get quite humiliated. So, the priest is attempting in an exorcism to put them under his authority, and they resist that. They feel humiliated by being commanded by the priest. And for a while, they put up a struggle. They'll say things like, again, I've attended a couple of hundred exorcisms, Catholic exorcisms, and other exorcisms too.
Oh, interesting. Yes.
And they will say, I'm not obeying you. That's what you think. But eventually, as the exorcism proceeds, if it goes well, the priest establishes command over them by the authority of our Lord, and they have to submit, and eventually they have to go. And that's how exorcisms work. Although people should also, people can misunderstand exorcisms too, because they think of it as some kind of magic. It's not magic, it's prayers. It's prayers of the church. Prayers of the church united to seek the help of our Lord to do the ultimate deliverance. But at the same time, this brings me back to Julia, at the same time, the person has to want to be freed. They have to repent of their past behavior and involvement in anything occult or satanic.
So just as they had to, sorry to interrupt, but just as they originally had to invite the unclean spirits into their lives, similarly they
in some way, it could be more implicit, but in some way,
yes. But
they had to invite it in, allow it in, you might say,
yes,
or at least the state of their inner being, which has turned to evil, has allowed it in. In the same way, they now have to renounce their former ways. And
does that mean necessarily taking on does that automatically necessarily imply taking having a religious orientation?
Normally, yes. Normally, they have to turn to God.
Yes.
They have to work on a spiritual practice. And this is why most people who are granted the right to an exorcism have gotten into the state where they've said, look, I got to get rid of this, teach me how to turn to God.
Yes.
Whereas Julia was conflicted. First of all, she liked her psychic abilities. Second of all, she was sort of in love with the leader, the high priest of the cult.
Right.
And she was playing a little bit of a double game, telling him, well, I'll infiltrate the church, I'll get these priests in trouble. I found this out subsequently.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the cult had been her family. Now, again, I don't want people to think, we see cults everywhere. They're not everywhere. They're not around every corner, but they exist, a few of them.
And at the same time, if I may interject very quickly, at the same time, I can't help but notice that there is, for want of a better way of putting it, there's almost like a normalization of the occult in public discourse.
Well, that's true too.
At at tremendous pace right now, and with many of these films, I apologize, but and one film that came out a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I forget exactly. I think it's called Midsommar. Without going into too many details, I never watched that. Saw a very lengthy dissection of it, and I realized I don't need to watch that. I don't need that impacting on my psyche. But the people who dissected it very brilliantly and sort of a very academic fashion they're saying these are actual rituals that they're depicting, that are rituals that take place. These are occult rituals, the use of runes. These are the runes which actually have history and have meaning. So to imbibe that, I mean, I guess my point being, there's greater coming out into the open, as it were, of a lot of these.
It certainly happened in the Western world. Now, for instance, paganism still exists in large pockets of the world, especially in Africa, certain parts of Asia. But you might say, to use the term neo-paganism, has erupted in the West, in Europe and in America in a very blatant way. You're absolutely right. And so you actually have people, profiled in periodicals who call themselves witches and stuff, or Wiccans, or, and yes, these people are engaged in very foolish activity. But Julia was, sort of, and she described herself as a kind of pagan too, but a Satan worshiper to the nth degree. And she also was afraid of the cult. So she was afraid of leaving it because she had revealed a lot. And, she was afraid that if she ever did, sort of convert to Christianity or something, and she had been baptized as a kid. She was baptized Catholic. But then had turned to this satanic cult. She was afraid that the cult would retaliate and hurt her, maybe even kill her. So it was a little dicey. The net result was that she never really renounced her Satanism, and therefore,
Ultimately,
she did not.
Oh, fascinating.
And ultimately, therefore, she was not delivered.
Oh, wow.
Couldn't be delivered while she was still.
Yes, of course. Yes.
That's part of the reason why the priest wanted me to talk to her so much, because clearly she was a tortured, tragic figure. She knew she was possessed. And again, often she would go into a trance, so it's not like it was that obvious to her. But she had plenty of people tell her, hey, you went into a trance, so-and-so demon, spoke out of you. Just as what I had witnessed, and the priest and quite a few other people had witnessed ourselves. She wanted it both ways. She wanted to have her cake and eat it too. She wanted to be liberated from this possession,
but maintain her special gifts, as it were.
And that's, you can't do that.
Right.
You can't do that.
I wanted to, on the question of gifts, I wanted to raise one question or make one remark, and I'd really appreciate your insights. So vis-a-vis things like psychic abilities or intuition and things like that, we also know, of course, that these can actually be spiritual gifts bestowed upon a person from God, from on high.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And of course, I think qualitatively that looks different. Of course, it looks different first and foremost in the person itself. The person has to be.
And as we say, the fruits are different. It leads to something holy and good rather than, magical and sometimes nefarious.
Biblical verse that comes to mind: by their fruits ye shall know them. Of course, right?
Exactly. And yes, I mean, I'm certainly not denying that there are spiritually gifted people. Yes. Saintly people, holy people. And it goes back to, what I was saying before, that all these weird phenomena, whether it's diabolic, whether it's hauntings, whether it's spiritually gifted people, what are sometimes called charisms, they only have one of two sources, They don't come from any innate human abilities.
Right.
They don't come from some kind of spiritual genius of the human brain or something, untapped potentials of all of us or something. They come from God or they come from the devil.
Yes.
So they're either, again, using the traditional Thomistic language, they're either supernatural or they're preternatural.
Yes.
And it's the preternatural that is the term that characterizes what we see and what helps us confirm that either there's a possession or a possession. And you have to have sort of indication of that. You have to have some historical context. You have to have some outright attack on an involuntary person for one to really diagnose something that can be, addressed by spiritual means. Because there are also people who have allowed themselves, if only for temporary periods, say, to be possessed. I don't know how much you've studied, Mr. Azad, classical history, but, people talk about the Delphic oracle having this hidden knowledge. And she would put herself into a trance. Now, like anything else in life, academically, there's all kinds of different theories, was she imbibing vapors, et cetera, et cetera. But people from all over the, Mediterranean world would come to consult her for this hidden knowledge that she claimed she got from the gods. This is why later Christian, Jewish, and probably Islamic writers felt that a lot of these pagan deities were essentially, demonic in nature. But the Delphic oracle and other oracles, would go into a trance. They would reveal this hidden knowledge. They often would not remember it afterwards. That's a possession too. There's a story of an American gangster in the Latin American gang MS-13. You may have heard of that. It's it's a notorious gang in the United States, and they're very devoted to Satanism, occultism. And one of its members who left and became a Christian, he described himself as they would get in a ritual circle. One of them would be designated as calling on a demon to possess them, and then they would reveal this hidden knowledge.
Oh, wow.
Say of someone who had betrayed them, So it's a complicated subject, which is why it's been so confusing in history. In other words, there are voluntary possessions as well as involuntary possessions. There's lesser attacks as well as the more severe attacks of possession. There are even some people who are possessed in a lucid state, not always in a trance. So I would say that the evil spirits, to confuse us, vary their modus immensely.
Interesting.
And a big part of their weapons is to confuse us, corrupt us, and just to physically attack us if they can. And St. Augustine, who was an exorcist himself, as well as a philosopher, as you know, is very experienced in this realm. He said something that I had originally thought was kind of an early medieval superstition. He said that if it was not for the saving protection of, God and his church and his saints, that demons would most likely try to kill us all. And I used to think this was some kind of medieval hyperbole. That is, I think, their level of hatred and animosity towards human beings. Presumably, again, because we're God's creatures who can still respond to God and who are made in the image of God.
Yes.
Their ultimate hatred, I'm convinced, is for God Himself.
And which, of course, stems from a deep self-hatred as well.
Well, presumably, those two things often go together. Yeah.
I wanted to actually, something that occurs to me, that on the question of, you mentioned voluntary versus involuntary, and to what extent, I think, to my understanding also, these sort of demonic entities, they, at the end of the day, they're all creatures of God, so they are ultimately subservient to God. But in this sort of temporal plane,
we're not dualist.
Right.
The Abrahamic phase, as you know, are opposed to dualism, say Zoroastrianism or something like that, or Manichaeanism.
Right.
So that, they're all subject ultimately to God,
and they will die, and they will have. But in this temporal realm, one of the I think one of the challenges that they pose for us as free-willed agents, as having agency, that they can tempt us with these supposed gifts, and the famous, the Faustian Goethe's idea of Dr. Faustus and the Faustian bargain, that if you sell your soul, then you will get XYZ benefits in this world, in this realm. And it occurs to me, and this is a work I'm going through currently very slowly. It's quite an old work at this point, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts. It's called The Occult Roots of Nazism, and it's an academic work written by Nicholas Goodrick Clark. It's some years old now, and he argues very convincingly that, as other scholars have subsequently argued, that Nazism the Nazis owed a lot of their tremendous mind-blowing technological advances for their time, compared to everyone else, all their contemporaries, to some sort of unseen occult dimension. And
yeah, I mean, it is. You're an academic as well as myself, and there is controversy about to what extent they were formal occultists. They were the Nazis were certainly neo-pagans of sorts. This whole Aryan mythology stuff, and I have seen what I think is good evidence that Hitler himself was a type of occultist, that he had certainly had some paranormal experiences, although other people dispute that. So clearly, though, in Nazism's turn to massive evil, they in many ways were playing with diabolic forces.
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, this is. Thank you so much. If you could speak a little bit, more to this apparent sort of tension between faith and science. Again, your work, I think, very powerfully, clearly sort of speaks against that supposed tension, that artificial divide that we all too often, it's a trope right now that's just floating in the air. But then if people study history, we know that Christian monks were some of the first scientists, that they were very rational thinkers. They weren't anti-science. Absolutely. As it's presented today. So, and I can't help but thinking, I mean, excuse the kind of religious language, overtly, I mean, religious people have to make excuses for themselves nowadays for their religious language, but I can't help but feel that part of this is almost a demonic ploy to say that religion is all bunk. It's all stupidity, it's all ignorance, it's darkness, and yet so much of what we take for granted today as being beneficial to us has its very serious roots in religious intellectual history.
No, I agree with most of what you say. One perspective on this that I sort of quote and find amusing is, though, the saying of someone, don't ascribe to malice what is easily explained by stupidity.
Sure. Yes.
There's a lot of ignorance, and always has been, in human nature. So to what extent that human ignorance in itself underlies, most of the tension between science and faith, I don't know. But again, as someone in the Catholic tradition, I don't see a contradiction between the two. Now, they each have their realm and their realm of epistemological principles. And science, as we understand it in the modern world, and the original word science comes from the Latin scientia, which came from the Greek episteme. It meant knowledge.
Right.
It means just a particular, type of knowledge.
Exactly. Yes.
They would say, we know what nobility is. That's a type of knowledge. I mean, certainly the Plato and Aristotle would have said that. So, knowledge can be defined in different ways. Modern science has advanced legitimately based on the principle of what's called methodological naturalism. As we study things without positing that there are, forces outside the material universe at work. But if you look at historical evidence for religious phenomena, and even the reasoning of, what was called natural theology, which was actually borrowed by the early Christian philosophers from the Greeks. This is a type of knowledge too, in my opinion. And, it just has its own, criteria of plausibility. I mean, when I look at cases of the demonic, I'm attempting to be rigorous in my thinking. And there's a lot of analogies between making a medical diagnosis, which depends on, certain criteria, and sometimes there's a little confusion about the boundaries. And it's the same with demonic conditions, the boundaries are not always perfectly clear, but we see phenomena that can be characterized, that can be classified, and it's just as scientific as most other forms of knowledge. Just because something is historical, George Washington crossing the Delaware, we can't logically prove it. We can't prove it in a lab. We can't prove that demonic possessions exist because of lab tests or x-rays, but that doesn't mean
and I think this
that
is
it's unscientific.
And it stands to reason that it cannot be proven in a modern scientific context, precisely because the modern scientific paradigm is a paradigm, and it is a window onto reality writ large. And it is very limited. It has a specific focal point. I remember you may have come across this powerful metaphor by the very brilliant and famous historian of religion and thinker Houston Smith in I forget which work it was. I can see the cover flashing before my eyes now. But the metaphor he uses is that of a torchlight. It's the torchlight has a very focused beam, but it doesn't allow us to see the entirety of what's around us. And just because we can't see it, just because the light isn't flashing, is not enlightening everything else, doesn't mean everything else doesn't exist. I think that's also very interesting for me from a philosophical point of view.
Right. I mean, another way of putting it, which is, the scientific method as understood is very valid within its realm, but its realm is more the realm of materialism.
Right.
Well, if you're talking about spiritual phenomena, you're using different types of rigorous reasoning, but you're using more historical reasoning, and you're studying this stuff the way you study history. Certain things have credibility, certain things don't. One of the more common comments I have about the work I do is, well, you say you've talked to 30 people who have seen levitation. How come we don't have videotapes? And I say, well, it's a naive question on your part.
Right.
You think these evil spirits are going to perform for the camera? They know they're being videotaped. Again, this is not some ability of the human person to, defy the laws of gravity. The spirits are not bound, just as God is not bound by the laws of gravity. Material creation is, but apparently spiritual entities have some ability to affect material creation. So you're just not going to see videotapes. I'll tell you one more piece of reflection upon scientific evidence that comes up.
Yes.
I have talked to a number of people in the Catholic Church. You can audio tape an exorcism. It's kept discreet, but you can do it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's studied, and it never seems to convince everybody. But audio tapes could easily be doctored, whatever. But at least in the Catholic tradition, formal exorcisms, it's forbidden to videotape them. It's regarded as an invasion of privacy. Not that I think demons would just perform for the camera anyway. They would refrain. They've been hiding for millennia. They're not going to all of a sudden make their condition obvious. Even though they overtly attack some people, they seem to also have a complementary strategy of remaining hidden to a lot of other people. So they're not going to make it easy for, students of these phenomena to recognize them. But I have met a few people, especially in sort of fundamentalist circles, who have taped some dramatic features of exorcisms. And then they show it to me or to other people, and they say, "Doctor, I can't explain this. The tape is now blank."
Oh,
Now that can seem self-serving to some people. Oh yeah, sure, it's
it
blank.
makes sense, yeah.
But they do seem to have the ability to interfere
Yeah.
with certain electronic communication.
Well, I mean, that makes sense to me. It's
The debate goes on, you know what I mean? The debates, in my opinion, the debates will go on. A lot of the Society for Psychical Research, which was founded in England about 150 years ago, which was a bunch of intellectuals, including William James, and
oh yes, I think I remember hearing about this. Yes.
and they studied a lot of these paranormal phenomena. And I think they were naive in thinking, well, we just need to do more and more experiments. We just need to do more and more, get more and more evidence, and we'll figure this stuff out. And it can't be figured out using the kind of materialist methodology.
Right.
And that becomes and to think so becomes a kind of scientism, a word you used earlier.
Well, no, this is, I think, at the core of so many of our issues today is the issue of scientism. And I mean, I was speaking some months ago now to he's a theoretical physicist who teaches at Brown, Stefan Alexander, and I proposed to him that consciousness cannot be explained through physics, through material, through the material aspect of the dimension of our being, which is very real, does not explain that which transcends the material, which is even consciousness on a sort of more lower level is not to mention sort of the spirit, even before going to that, just consciousness itself. Even from a philosophical point of view, I remember it being mentioned by, I forget his name now, but he's a very well-regarded thinker who also, he thinks about modern thought and a sort of contemporary modern predicament. And he argues that just to, the very fact that you and I can connect and that you and I can understand each other philosophically based on modern reasoning cannot be explained. It does not make any sense.
Right.
But we understand, of course, just traditional
understand consciousness and much of human experience simply on narrow materialistic grounds. And of course, most philosophers throughout history, probably most philosophers throughout history, including Plato, for instance, would have absolutely agreed with that. Having said, I'm not a simplistic dualist either. I mean, God created us, body and soul, inextricably combined.
Yes.
And so, I do believe in the resurrection of the body. It's not like we will ever be simply disembodied ghosts.
Right.
We're part of our human nature, which most sophisticated Christian theologians see the body as not extrinsic to the idea of the soul, but an integral part of that.
Of course.
But that there is something, spiritual, soul-like at the heart of human nature as well. It cannot be simply explained on the basis of atoms in the brain.
And to your point, the sort of very embodied nature of our being. This is something that's being written about more and more in the academy. And but to your point regarding the church fathers and the earlier thinkers, the metaphor that I've had occasion to mention a few times, which is used by René Guénon, the great French metaphysician, who in describing the symbolism of the cross, he said that what we understand from ultimately the symbol of the cross is ultimately endlessly pregnant with meaning. But one meaning that we can derive is that the horizontal plane is always pierced by the vertical, which is the transcendent and so forth. But there is that fundamental piercing of the two into penetration, as it were. I'm sort of paraphrasing terribly, but so that's something we can never get away from. And I think anytime if there's an overemphasis on any one of those dimensions, if the spiritual supposedly is emphasized over the physical or vice versa, that's when we run into troubles. And I think this is something we have to always be negotiating.
Yes. Well, I mentioned to you that based on some of your other work, I find you a thoughtful interlocutor, and I'd be happy to come back. I probably should
Yes.
get onto a few other things now, but I enjoyed our discussion. I'd be happy to do it again if you want. About
I very much appreciate it, and God bless you. Thank you so much for your time.
some related topic that you want to discuss, and certainly I know you have an interest in healing and all that sort of thing. So feel free to invite me back, but I thoroughly enjoyed
Thank you.
our
Thank you so much.
discussion.
Such an honor, genuinely, and very much appreciated.